In this video, I'm going to show you my favorite wet watercolor techniques. Enjoy! The first technique I'm going to show you is called blooms. And blooms can be done on paper that is wet with just clean water or on paper that is wet with paint. So first I'm going to take some just clean water and use that to get half of each of these papers wet. Now the top of these papers was stretched before being taped and the bottom one was taped dry. And when I say stretching watercolor paper, what you do is you get the watercolor paper thoroughly wet by painting or spraying both sides with water and then allowing the paper to absorb that water, and it naturally expands as it absorbs the water. So it stretches itself. You don't have to like pull it with your hands or anything. And then you tape it down to a board while it is still damp, but not shiny wet. So right now, both of these papers are shiny wet, and you have to wait, when you're doing blooms, you have to wait until it's the right level of shiny. If there is surface water that is running on the surface, that's too wet. But if there's no shine left, then that's too dry. And all a bloom is you get paint onto your paintbrush, and then you just touch that to the wet surface and it expands by diffusion into what is called a bloom. So there's a bloom on both of those pieces of paper. Like I said, you can also do blooms into paint, so it doesn't have to be a bloom into plain wet paper. You can do a bloom into paint. So here I'm going to paint on this neutral purple color, and I'm going to just make it super dark by adding some blue, some pretty thick blue. So we've got a nice dark color here, and because I want to show you that when you're doing blooms, you don't have to do dark into light. You can do a light color. I'm going to get like a little bit of orange wash, and I'm waiting just a little bit because I can see when I tilt the board that there's still surface water on there, so I want to wait till it's just a little bit less wet when it is shiny but not running. So there's just a little bit of waiting involved. While I'm doing that, let me just, so now that this has been drying for a little bit, the blooms will generally change a bit. Although that one looks like it was in a puddle. I had probably retouched it. You probably remember that more than I do. There's a slightly wet area, and then here's going to be a slightly drier area. So the blooms change as it dries. You can also keep tapping color into the same spot, and that bloom will get both larger and more vivid. So you can use this for all sorts of effects. You can absolutely use it to indicate flowers. I've seen people use it to indicate other kinds of foliage, fireworks. I use it for animal spots. You can use it for whatever your imagination tells you it looks like. Okay, so I think the blue is now ready and I can start blooming into that. That's still a bit wet. So if it's still a bit wet, you get a really huge bloom, and it spreads kind of funny. So I'm going to wait for that blue to dry a little bit. While I'm waiting for that blue to dry just a little bit, I'm going to create another spot of color on this dry paper. Both techniques work perfectly well, whether your paper was stretched or not stretched. In a little bit, I'll show you what the difference between stretched and not stretched paper is. I just want this to be... Alright, so while I'm waiting for this to dry a little bit, because it's just a little bit too wet for really nice blooms, I'm going to do a backwash. A backwash is exactly the same as the bloom, except the brush has plain water. So plain, clean water on it. So in this area, I'm going to try doing a backwash. Again, it's a little bit wet. These are really good experiments to do because you learn to recognize the right level of wetness of paint for it to do different effects. The level of wetness is really important. And this one right here, I still see like so much surface water that I kind of want to wait for a little bit, but we'll see. You can do backwashes in lines. You can do backwashes in dots. And as you can see, the plain clear water pushes an area of the paint away and creates a pale or sometimes even white area in your paint. And just like tapping in paint, you can tap in more water to create larger, clearer white areas. I love using this for glows. So I can tap in a glow into a dark background. I'm going to try blooming in here again. So again, you just tap the paint in. You can tap in the same area to create a more vivid bloom. You can also create a line of bloom. You can reinforce that line and to make it both expand and also become more vivid at the center. When you're making a line, if you pause while making the line, that area of the line will be more vivid and larger. So there's a couple different effects you can do. I think I'm ready to show you the difference between stretched paper and paper that has been taped dry. So everything works the same. All the blooms and the backwashes and all of that will be the same. The only difference is that when you tape the paper dry, the paper still expands as it absorbs the water. And in order to have the ability to expand, even though it's taped in place, what it does is it makes a little hill. So I have a little bead here, and the hill is right in the center of the paper. If I put the bead on the hill, whoa, it's not doing it, but it will just roll down the hill. So it can roll either way because there's a hill. But if it's stretched, first it's flat. So even if I try to make it roll, it doesn't really want to roll because there's no hill. Because there is a hill here, if you're working with large areas or with a lot of water or very wet washes, your water will run downhill. So here you can see the water is kind of puddling at the edges, and it's puddling at the edges partially because it just ran downhill. So it's going to be a little bit thinner at the top of the hill, and then where the water ran downhill and kind of pooled at the bottom, it's going to be a little bit darker. So you will get a little bit of unevenness. If you have a large area, it won't make just one big hill, it'll make like hills and valleys, and the water will run down into those valleys and pool and make all sorts of weird watermarks that you probably don't want. So if you are painting large areas with very wet washes, you do want to stretch your paper first so that you avoid those hills. Okay, next I have feathering, which is my very most favorite technique, and I'm just going to do this on dry paper that's not even taped. It doesn't even have to be if you're doing small areas of paint. Draw around the shape with clean water first so that has a little bit of time to dry. And then put my shape inside there, and you have to make sure that you don't touch your water area until you're ready, or else wherever you touch it will make a huge explosion instead of a nice even fuzzy outline. Alright, so I've got my shape here. I'm going to see if I can flash it for you so that you can see that there's water around it. The water's still a little bit too wet. I want it to be like a matte shine like it is right here. It's actually perfect right here. And then there's an area of dry paper in between the shape that I drew in orange and the border that I drew in water. Okay, it's driest on this side and then it's wettest down at the bottom, so I'm actually going to start on this side and then go around. So it's got the same fuzzy edge as a bloom, but again, I controlled the shape. So instead of whatever random shape physics determined, I've got this little, I don't know, bean shape. All right, so that one is called feathering. Very similar to blooms and backwashes with the controlled shape. The last one I'm going to show you is a wet gradient. So this looks really pretty in backgrounds. Backgrounds look really nice if they're not completely even, I think. So you just start with rather dense paint. So I've got not quite a honey consistency. This is more like a milk consistency. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dip my brush into clean water. That was a little too wet, so I'm going to dry it off a little bit. And now I'm just going to keep painting, but using that brush that I dipped into water. And then I'm going to do it again. I just dip my brush into clean water. So that clean water is just pulling the paint so that it has a smooth gradient from the dense paint to the less dense paint. You can also do this with different colors. So if, for example, I wanted to go from this brilliant scarlet color, I just get the next color of paint onto my brush while it's still wet and just continue painting as if I was painting all with one color. You do want to try and have the amount of water on or paint on your brush be pretty consistent, because if you have, like this one was a little bit too wet, so it's actually backwashing into the last color, because the paint, like wherever the most wet area is going to be the area that pushes. And then it kind of grades rather abruptly because I ran out of paint. So you can do those gradients with either just water after the first little bit or with new colors, and you get a smooth gradient, as opposed to dry techniques which give you a gradient but there's a very clear distinction between the different colors or different shades of the same color. Alright, so those are some of my favorite wet techniques. Thanks for joining me.